Unfortunately, this team just won the NBA Finals most recently, but it's okay. You know, nothing wrong with some skinheads winning the NBA Finals. To be real, I don't even watch the NBA all that often, but I do love basketball, as you could tell from this clip right here. That was a rough one. I do have this really cool shot of me though, and I'll let y'all figure out if I missed this or not. Anyway, as far back as I can remember, this guy used to be such a huge inspiration for me. Yes, I used to have hoop dreams. One of my first design experiences ever was designing a Steph Curry wallpaper to use back when I was like 13. That's my GOAT. So I figured if I want to make a vintage inspired NBA graphic, I gotta put him on there, even though he's not particularly vintage, not yet. So let's do it. Let's make this vintage inspired NBA graphic using Photoshop and Illustrator. I'm going to teach you how to do this cool line halftone effect and get a comic look like this on your designs. So let's go. Let's start in my classic document size in Photoshop. That is 16 by 20 inches at 300 DPI. I'm going to go ahead and make this new document here. And then the actual first thing we want to do is make another document. So go Command N on your keyboard. And for this document, we're actually going to go down to 8 by 8 pixels. Make sure that's pixels. Oops. Okay, 8 by 8 pixels, and then resolution at 72. So go ahead and create that document. All right, really tiny document here, and you'll see why in just a second. Basically, we're making a pattern for the graphic that we're going to make here. So go ahead and grab the line tool or the rectangle tool, actually from the shapes tool, and just create a big long line across the document. I want to make sure this is black, and then I'm just going to rotate it 45 degrees. So I'm going to hold down Shift on my keyboard, and that way I can figure out exactly 45 degrees. I want to move that to the center of the document so that the darkest pixels are along the center diagonal line within this document. Okay, now we want to take this rectangle that we just made and duplicate that 2 times. And on the top one, we're going to drag that up and to the left until we have just these sort of 3 pixels peeking out of the corner here. So I can't zoom in anymore, but you see we have that dark pixel in the top left corner and then these 2 lighter pixels surrounding it. I want to do the same thing with the middle duplicate here. So drag that down and to the right until we have just that corner filled out with the dark pixel all the way in the corner and the 2 lighter pixels surrounding it. Then on top of all this, we're going to add a levels adjustment. So go ahead and bring in that levels adjustment and turn up the midtones just a little bit, turn it up somewhere midway. And then we're also going to drag the black input level up just a little bit to brighten up this whole little pattern that we're making here. So right around here looks good. And then what we're going to do is Command Option Shift E on our keyboard to merge everything. And then we're going to do Command A on our keyboard. That's going to select the whole canvas. And then we'll go up to Edit, Define Pattern, and name this whatever you want to name this. I'm just going to name this line pattern halftone. Now we can go back to our big document and we can throw our subject in here now. So like I said, I'm doing a vintage Steph Curry design. So I'm going to throw in a photo of Steph Curry, and this along with any other assets I use in this video will be linked in the description if you want to follow along and design with me. So we have this photo of Steph Curry in here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger to get our subject really in the limelight here. Now we obviously want just Curry in this. So I'm going to do the select subject function using the magic wand here, and then select subject, which is up here in the little nav bar. I did a pretty good selection, but maybe too good of a selection because now we have another player in this when we just want Curry. I'm actually going to try that again, maybe use the device option, see if that does anything. It looks like I'm just going to have to take this guy out. So right now I'm going to make a mask on this image layer, and I'm just going to paint over everything that's not Curry. So I'm just using a hard brush here to mask Curry out. All right, looking good, but the selection is still a little bit finicky and sort of soft and just low quality around the edges here. So I'm actually going to use the select and mask function to tighten that up. So I'll go ahead and click on the layer mask and click on select and mask. And this is going to help us sort of tighten up and smooth out the selection. Fun fact, the select and mask stuff actually sucks. And I don't know why, but on my computer, it always goes really slow and I can never see the final results of the selection. So what I usually do actually is go and grab a selection of our subject, and on that layer, I'll go up to select, and select and mask is here again. But if you hold down Shift while we click on that, we can actually go to the legacy version of select and mask, which is called refine edge, and this just works a lot faster than select and mask for me. So that's what I'll be using. I'm going to turn the smoothness up, and I can check how my selection looks in this view mode here. So I'm going to click on overlay. I'm just going to turn the smoothness up, the radius down maybe a little bit, the shift edge I want it inwards a little bit so we get rid of that halo, and the contrast I want all the way up. And I'll press OK on this, and now we have a better selection of our subject. All right, it's looking good. Now I'm going to duplicate this layer with Command J. I'm going to hide this original layer, and I'm going to rasterize the layer mask that we put on this layer here. And we're actually going to want to duplicate this a couple times. So duplicate this twice using Command J on your keyboard. So now we have 3 Steph Currys here. So we have our 3 duplicates here. So let's bring in that pattern that we just made earlier. So we'll go up to our adjustment layers and bring in a pattern, and obviously just choose the pattern we just made. For me, that's this one called Line Halftone. And the pattern is very, very small, but when we zoom in, we see we have that perfect line halftone going across our document. This is too small to even see, so let's go ahead and make this a lot bigger. Let's choose a scale of about 4 to 500. I'm gonna go with 400 here, and we're gonna set this layer to overlay. Now we can bring in a threshold adjustment on top of all this, and once we do that, you see we have this very cool line halftone effect going on our subject. So that is pretty cool, and you can use this setup for any number of designs that you want this cool line halftone effect on. For this specific design, since I'm going for more of a comic look, I want to actually mess with this pattern a bit. So as you can see, when we zoom in here, it looks good, but it's very rough and harsh on the edges. And I want it to kind of taper out as we move from one group of values to the next. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to rasterize this pattern fill layer. So I'll go ahead and rasterize that layer. And I just want to go ahead and blur it by about 2 pixels. So Gaussian blur this by 2 pixels. And now you can see we have a little bit more of a nicer taper on this pattern. So when we're transitioning from shadows to highlights, there's a little bit more of a taper going on those lines now. And that just makes for a nicer sort of comic illustrated effect. Cool. Now let's put these 2 things in a group and name that our effects group so that we don't mess with that too much. You kind of have that set on the back burner. And now let's focus on our duplicates of the subject here. On the top duplicate, you want to do Command U on your keyboard. That's going to bring up hue and saturation. Just turn the saturation of that all the way down. Then let's go over to filter, stylize, and find edges. And that's going to create these very cool outlines on our subject to give it that comic look once we set this layer to multiply. So now we have those edges sort of going around different parts of our subject, which gives it that illustrated effect. We can also duplicate this layer a few times to heighten that effect, or you can go up to filter, other, and then minimum. And this is going to allow you to sort of thicken up those black lines by turning up this radius to whatever amount that you want. So 4 here, as you can see, really thickens up those lines. I'm going to go with something a little less extreme like 2. Press OK on that. Now on the second duplicate here, we're going to go up to filter, other, and then high pass. And you can honestly play with this value as much as you want. It's going to affect sort of that comic look on your subject. I like keeping it anywhere from 10 to 40, which is a large range, but go ahead and experiment with this. For now, I'm going to choose around 30, press OK on that. And then we can set this layer to either overlay or soft light, depending on what looks better on your image. And then finally, on this bottom layer here, we're actually going to desaturate this as well. So Command U and bring the saturation all the way down. And then we want to just add a slight blur to this with blur, surface blur, and this is just going to smooth out any noise on the image. So you can play with these values. I'll press OK on that. By the way, you can also make these layers smart objects before you do all the effects to make them non-destructive, and so that you can edit the numbers and intensity of the effects after you do them. But I just don't like smart objects, so I'm not going to do that, but feel free to do so. Now on this bottom layer, you can also use the highlights and shadows adjustment to bring out more detail in areas where you might want it. So that's up in image, adjustments, and then shadows and highlights. And from here you can play with the intensity or brightness of the shadows or the highlights to make them darker, or the shadows to lighten them up. This filter is really good when you're thresholding to bring out more detail in your subject. As you can see, just by turning up the highlights or shadows, we get a lot more detail on different parts of the subject. I'm going to keep these shadows up a good amount, and I'll play with the radius here to get a little bit of a different effect. Then I'll play with the highlights as well until I find something I like. All right, cool, that's looking good. I'll press OK on that. Now let's put all of these 3 layers in a group so we don't get confused. I'm going to name this Curry, and above that we can add a levels adjustment to further mess with the brightness and just the levels of this image if you need it brighter or darker. Keep in mind that we are going to be coloring in this graphic wherever there is white, so we do want to keep it fairly light, lighter than you usually would. I'm going to set that around here. Now I'm going to put all of this in a group, so the effects, the levels, and our subject here. So I'll select all of them and Command G to put that in its own group, and I'm just going to name this Curry again, I guess. Then let's take that layer mask that we had originally on the image and drag that over to our group. Hold down Alt, click on that layer mask, and drag that to the group with our subject. And we want to make sure the edges are hard on this layer mask. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down Alt and click on that layer mask to make sure that all the edges in this all hard and we don't have any transparencies here. So there's a little transparency here, and we can easily fix this just by going up to Image, Adjustments, and then thresholding this once more. So this is going to threshold the layer mask and make sure that we have no transparency on those transparent or feathered edges. I'll press OK on that and click back on this group. Now we want to duplicate out this group. So let's go ahead, make sure we have the group clicked, and then we can apply the layer mask on that new layer too. So go ahead and apply that layer mask so we don't have all the extra stuff in the background, even though it was layer masked out, but we just don't want that unnecessary info in there. So this is going to be our base. Then let's go ahead and hide this, go back into our subject group, and on top of the levels but below the effects group, let's go ahead and add another levels and bring these shadows of this all the way in until we get just the specular highlight of our subject peeping out. So we just want to move these levels until we get the brightest of bright highlights on this subject. Around here is good. Now I'm going to close this group and do the same thing. So Command Alt E on our keyboards to duplicate that onto its own layer. I'm going to hide this, and then we can apply the layer mask to this one as well. And we want to name this one our highlight layer and this one our base. Now the line halftones on both our base and highlight layers are looking good, but they're not as smooth as I want them to be. So to fix that, I'll click on one of these layers and we're going to go up to Filter, Filter Gallery, and all I want to add here is a stamp filter that's in the sketch folder. And from here we can play with sort of the smoothness of these lines to get more of a tapered and comic effect. So you can see with the smoothness at 1, these lines are a little bit harsh and rough around the edges, but as we turn that smoothness up, they get a little bit more friendly and nicer around the edges. So I'm going to just turn the smoothness up until I find a nice point for that. I think around 6 works. So I'll click OK on that, and I'm going to do the same thing for the highlight layer. Go up to Filter, Filter Gallery, and mess with the smoothness until I find something nice. Around 6 looks good, so press OK on that. Big difference from what we started with just by using the simple stamp filter in the filter gallery. So here's the after, and here would be the before. So we got rid of all that unnecessary noise and grain and just rough edges around that halftone. Now let's take our highlight layer and select out and delete all the black. So we'll go ahead and click on our magic wand tool, make sure contiguous and anti-alias is unchecked. Click on that black and just delete it. And now we're left with just the white highlight of this, which you can't see right now because we're on a white background, but that's going to come very in handy later. So just drag that above your base layer. For now, let's turn back on our base layer, and we're going to make a group and colorful layer above this, start coloring in this graphic. So go down here to create a new solid color layer, and this is going to be for the skin. So just pick whatever skin tone fits your subject. Then let's put that colorful layer in a group with Command G and set the blending mode of that group to multiply, and that way it's only going to affect the white parts of this image. But as you can see, it's affecting the entire background as well. So easy fix for that. Let's just go ahead and hold down Command while clicking on the layer thumbnail of our base layer. That's going to select our subject, then go back to our group and create a mask on that group to mask it to just our subject. And now we can use a hard brush in the layer mask of the colorful layer to paint in the skin tone wherever we want it. So if I want to start with a blank slate, I'm going to fill this entire layer mask with black, and now I can paint with a white hard brush to paint in that skin tone wherever I want it, and I can paint out of the lines, and I don't have to worry about it bleeding into the background because we have the layer mask selected to our subject on this entire group. And of course we can also duplicate this colorful layer and change it to whatever other color we want and start painting in that color in other places that we want it, say the jersey or something, to start coloring out the rest of this image. So I'm going to go ahead and use these colorful layers to paint in everything here, like his jersey and these skin tones, and I'll be right back. Okay, cool. So I painted out his jersey, his skin tones, and also his leg sleeve and his shoes here using just 3 colors. So that's one for the skin tone, one off-white for his leg sleeve and ankle brace and his mouthpiece, and the blue for his jersey. And here is where that highlight layer really comes in clutch and brings a whole lot of depth to this graphic. So once we turn that back on, we see we now have a whole new dimension to this graphic with those really cool highlights added on to this little illustrated graphic of Curry here. So we can keep those white if you want, or you can make them sort of an off-white. Really your choice. I like making it sort of a nice off-white so that we have a little bit less contrast on the graphic. You may also notice though that the highlights are creeping in to the parts of his jersey that should be yellow. So right around here, the edges of the jersey or the accents of the jersey. So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this highlight layer and set the color overlay to a yellow. And now I can make a layer mask on this highlight layer and invert it with Command I and just start painting in over the parts that should be yellow on his jersey. We've got our subject all done. He's got this really cool line halftone effect going on, and it gives him that really cool illustrated look. So now it's time to block out the the rest of the composition. So I'm actually doing this completely inspired by this design I saw that I thought was really, really cool. And obviously it also has that awesome lined halftone going on. So compositionally, I'm making something very similar. Feel free to go your own way and try out some stuff compositionally and just make the graphic entirely your own. But I'm going to be sort of recreating this graphic and getting us from here to here. So I actually did this whole sort of shape backing in Illustrator because it's just easier that way. So I'm going to show you how I did it really quickly. This is what I had comped up in Illustrator, and I am not an Illustrator guy, so bear with me. It's very, very simple though. All I did was take a rectangle, make a big rectangle for the backing of the graphic, take out the fill rather, and add a nice big stroke to that rectangle. Then I can go up to object and expand this. So now I can actually take this stroke, or what was a stroke, and knock out the fill of it and then add my own stroke on that. And now we have a stroke on a stroke, stroke inception. And then I could throw these little spheres in here to block out the rest of the shape. And I just did that again by making a rectangle. This is not going to be the same size, but obviously you'd probably want to duplicate the original rectangle you made, and going up to the stroke again and just changing that stroke to, all right, Illustrator sucks. Hold on guys. So you want to change that stroke to a dashed line, and then change the cap to a rounded cap, and that's going to fill the stroke of that rectangle with circles. And you can change the weight of that and the placement and the gap between them with this little input here, and then place that neatly within your rectangle. And the rest of this is very, very simple. Just a circle here that I made and threw the number 30 in there. And I believe the font for that is, I don't know, it's some sort of varsity font. The font is called Soccer League Regular, just a standard varsity font. You just make a circle with a stroke and throw a piece of type in there and typed out 30, obviously Curry's player number. That's pretty much it, besides for the arches here, or the banners, which I did not make myself because again, I'm not too good at Illustrator. You could totally make this yourself just by using the pen tool and the shape builder probably, but I'm not doing all that. So I actually downloaded a pack of banners for free on freepick.com, and I just dragged one of these into my composition and then added a stroke and a fill to it. So the top one I placed right here, and I also added this text here with the same font, Soccer League, and I added an arc to that type, which is, where is that? It's just a deformer on that type. So arch deformer, I had it around 30% to match the contour of that banner, and place that neatly on top of my rectangle. And then for the bottom banner here, which you could see in the final graphic, is overlaying on top of our subject. So I didn't want to place that directly in this little composition here because I'm going to bring it in later actually, so that we can place it on top of our subject. So I just kept that down at the bottom here for me to bring in later. The only thing I did after that was color code this with different colors so that when I brought it into Photoshop, I could just select out all the colors individually, and that makes it way easier to change the colors and move it around and put layer styles on it, because I don't want to be going back between Illustrator and Photoshop to do all that. Once I got this all mocked up, all I did was select the little composition here and Control C to copy, and then I put that into my Photoshop document with Control V, and that's going to paste it. I can paste it as a smart object or pixels. I'm just going to choose pixels here. So now I have that little Illustrator composition put into our Photoshop document with our subject here. I'm actually going to put all of this related to our subject in a group so that we don't get messy here. And then I could put the Illustrator composition behind that subject. And the rest of this process is very simple compositing. All I did was select out all the individual colors within this element here and put those all on their own layers by using the magic wand, selecting out each color and then layer via cut to put them on their own layer. And that way I can use the color overlay within Photoshop to color these pretty easily without having to go back and forth between Illustrator and Photoshop. I also obviously place this neatly and appropriately for our subject here, which I can then mask out to sort of make it look like he's fitting inside of the frame. So if I wanted to do that, all I would have to do is select out the rectangle that we used here and make a layer mask on the group of our subject. And this way it looks like he's actually inside of the frame, which is really cool. Eventually, after doing that and figuring out all the colors, this is where I ended up. So same thing, just different colors on pieces of this backing element here. I also had Curry a little bit bigger in this to sort of fill out most of the frame. And one thing you notice is in the final design, I had this really cool line gradient going on back here behind Curry within the frame of that rectangle. And that's really simple to do. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So basically, since I selected out the backing of this, I have it on its own layer. I can go ahead and duplicate this with Command J, go into the layer styles and add a gradient overlay onto this. And from here, I could pick pretty much the direction and the intensity of the gradient that I want. So in the original, I had it around here, a nice little angled gradient around 45 degrees. And then to get it to have that line halftones, all we have to do is bring this layer with the gradient overlay back into the original setup that we had with that threshold and the line halftone on top of it. So you can either make that again or just reuse the same setup. I'm going to go back into the original curry group that we had here, bring this effects group all the way on top of this layer, and that's going to put that line halftone effect onto the gradient overlay of this layer. To get that actually on its own layer, you see if we just merge these two, it's going to give us all this line halftone pattern in the back because we have no background for this. So to avoid that, all we have to do is add a white background layer behind this layer that has a gradient overlay. So I'll go ahead and make a new layer, just fill that with white, and then put that behind the layer with the gradient overlay. And now I can put this all in a group just to not get messy. I'm going to name this line halftone gradient, and then I can duplicate and merge that out with Command Alt Option E, and now we have this gradient on its own layer without all the extra pattern backing filling up the rest of the background. And it also has this white background in it, but that's pretty simple to remove. Just take your magic wand and select out that white and delete it. And now we could bring this line halftone version of this back into where I had the original frame and backing. So that's all the way in this group. I'm going to name this actually framing, and I'll bring this back into this group right here, and then I could just set this to whatever color I want. I had it white in the original, so I'll put a color overlay on this and set that to white. And now we have that cool line halftone effect behind curry in this nice little gradient form. And now you can see we're really getting there. One of the main things we're missing is that banner we had from before. As you can see in this final graphic, we have a nice banner going over curry. So again, that's just from Illustrator. I'll go ahead and open that back up, copy this into our Photoshop document, and I'll put that on top of curry. And then it's just a matter of recoloring this again by selecting out each color, putting it on its own layer, and coloring it however I want. Of course, you could just do that in Illustrator, but I find it's easier to do that in Photoshop in case I want to change the colors later on. So here's that banner from earlier. All I did again was change the colors of that to a yellow and black stroke. And I also added some text and the old Warriors logo on top of here to really fill it out. So in this group, I had the text just curry written out. I'm using the font clear face heavy, and I also added a little arc to it using the bend distortion in Photoshop. So the warp I had was set to arc and the bend was around 17, again to match the contours of that banner. And then I threw some layer styles on this, some simple stuff. It's just a stroke, white stroke, outside stroke set to 6 points. The color is black, so I have a color overlay for black. And then just a white drop shadow with the spread all the way at 100. This keeps the drop shadow harsh if I want to change the size. So let's say I change the size up and turn the spread all the way down. With the spread down, the drop shadow is transparent and it has these feathered gradients. But if I keep the spread all the way up and I mess with the size, now we have hard edges all around that drop shadow. And then I just cranked up the distance to add some depth and sort of a 3D look to this text. Pretty much same exact thing with the Warriors logo here. This logo is actually sick, so shout out to whoever made the old Warriors logo. I really like it. But I just dragged that in from Google pretty much and then added the same layer style on that top text here. So the Golden State Warriors and the basketball here both have that stroke and drop shadow on top of it to give it some more depth and fill out that banner and give it some nice style. I also happen to add that same layer style with the stroke and drop shadow onto Curry himself, and that gives him a lot of depth and separates him from the background. So if I just copy the same layer style that I had on that text and drag that over to our subject, turn off that color overlay so we can actually see our subject. Now we have this really cool stroke and drop shadow look going on, and it gives it more of a cartoon look. If I go into that drop shadow and start playing with the angle a bit and maybe the size, we can get more of a fine-tuned effect on this. And that works really well to separate him out from the background, which looks really nice and also adds to that comic illustrated effect. And that's pretty much the gist of it. All I did after that was add some supporting text like this golden boy up here using the font clear face heavy and this sort of stat line down here just pointing out his stats, or I don't know what you would call that, his origin story and his body stats. So you get the idea. So after we add all that in there, this graphic and composition is really starting to take shape. There's just a few more things I want to hone in on to really make this graphic ours and to make it look a little bit better. So for one, we have sort of an error going on here where I have the stroke and drop shadow on Curry. That stroke is bleeding out over the layer mask onto our frame, and it's a really simple fix for that. So usually when you add a layer mask to something that has layer styles in it, those layer styles are going to be affected by that layer mask, so they're pretty much acting on that layer after the layer mask. But if you want the layer mask to act on top of those effects, all you have to do is open up the blending options or the layer styles of that layer and go and click on layer mask hides effects, and that's going to hide the effects with the layer mask that we have in place. So now that stroke isn't peeping out of the bottom anymore, and it's actually being affected by the layer mask. And now this graphic is pretty much done, but if you haven't noticed, we've been taking some steps to minimize or cut down on any transparency that could be in this graphics. So there's no gradients or feathered pixels. It's all sharp pixels, and that's for a reason, because we actually want this to be screen printable by spot color. And not only that, it just makes the graphic look really, really cool. And obviously with that line halftone effect and everything else going on, it adds to that really cool illustrated look of the graphic. So once you've got the whole composition planned out, everything is looking just how you want, here's what I like to do to not only prepare a graphic for print, but to also add some finishing effects to really bring this graphic all together. So I'm going to put everything related to this graphic in a group, and I'm just going to name that graphic. And then I want to use Command Alt Option E on my keyboard to merge everything in this composition onto one layer. Now I can hide that graphic group, and I can go in and start selecting out each color within this graphic to change the colors and also add some finishing touches. And now we can go in and select out each color within this graphic to not only color separate the graphic, which is going to make it easy to print, say if you're sending this to a screen printer, but also it's going to help us pick colors that have more harmony together. So right now the colors of this graphic are all over the place because I mocked this up really roughly. But once I start putting all of these colors on their own layers, and I can choose their colors and see how they look alongside all the other colors, it's going to make a world of difference, which you'll see here in a second. So let's go ahead and start selecting out each color within this graphic. First thing I'll do actually is get rid of this white background because we want this to be transparent pretty much. So go ahead and delete out that white background. Just press delete on that. And now go in with your magic wand. Again, make sure anti-alias and contiguous are not checked. Just go ahead and select out each color within this graphic, and you can put this on its own layer using the layer via cut function here. However, if your graphic does have some slight soft edges like I have here on Curry, which can happen along the way, especially if you're scaling something, that's usually how you get these sort of softer edges on the graphic. So this is mostly pixel by pixel, and this is not going to have a problem when you print it. But just for selecting purposes, since we have these sort of slight soft edges here, that's called anti-aliasing, and you can actually check on anti-alias within the Magic Wand navbar to make sure you select out all of that color. So just in case you do have these sort of soft edges, you can go ahead and leave that checked to make sure you get all of the color when you're selecting it. Also, if you find that when you're using your Magic Wand, it's selecting colors that you don't want it to, say you select a white and it's also selecting an off-white or something of that matter, you can go ahead and change the tolerance to something lower. If you have this tolerance value really high, it's going to select out colors that you didn't pick. So keep this low around 24 to 12. I'm going to keep it at around 24. I'll start with the black here. Just going to go ahead, select that and layer via cut. And I'm going to repeat that process for every color in the graphic. So now yellow, I'll click on that, layer via cut. And I'm going to name these layers actually as I do it so I don't get confused later on. Go ahead and select out the blue. So now I have all of the colors of this graphic on their own separate layers. And now I can go into the layer styles and choose a color for them that's going to harmonize better with the rest of the colors in the graphic. So just using the reference graphic from earlier here, I'm going to go ahead and enter the layer styles of the black layer here. And I'll change this to a slightly off black. You can play around with this, to be honest. You could get some really cool looks by going up to a vibrant color or just like a nice off black, like a brownish. I might even choose that. And also another quick tip to get that really cool misregistered print effect that you saw on the final graphic, make sure your black color layer is above all the other color layers once you have it selected out, and go ahead and add a drop shadow on that layer style and turn the distance to around 2. Make sure the spreads on 100, the size on 0, and the color on white. And now when we zoom in here, we can see we have that really cool misregistered print where the colors are a little bit offset from the other colors, and it gives the graphic a bit more depth and just looks better overall. I don't know why it looks better. I don't know the psychology of it, but it looks really cool. You can also play with the angle here to get some varied effects. So that's a nice little quick tip for you. Now we can go into the yellow here, choose the color I want. I like the yellow I had in the original graphic. Same thing with the blue here. I'm going to choose the blue I had in the original graphic, maybe even make it a bit more vibrant, and that is looking pretty great to me. So I think we did a damn good job on this graphic here. Again, I didn't want to bog you down with the making of that little frame and whatnot in Illustrator and recoloring and all that in Photoshop because that's pretty simple stuff, and this video is already pretty long, but the real sauce of it is obviously making this really cool illustrated look on our subject here on Curry, getting those line halftones to look real sharp and nice and sort of cartoonish, and also coloring this in a way to get that nice graphic look, especially using that little trick that I showed you just now with that misregistered print effect. You get these little white outlines on the colors here. Gives it some really nice depth and extra texture. I absolutely love how this graphic turned out, and I encourage you to use everything I showed you in this video to come up with your own vintage inspired graphic, whether it be NBA related or sports related or something entirely different. I really want to see what you create with this. Also, we must not forget the holy grail to any vintage design is some vintage texture. So if I throw my warm plastisol texture on here, invert that really quick since we're on a white background, and set that to screen, bam. Look at that. Definitely go ahead and pick up my Worn Plastisol texture kit if you want to add this nice, vintage, authentic texture to your designs. Otherwise, I'd say we're clocking out of our design shift today. We did a real good job. And again, any assets I use are linked in the description of this video. If you want to follow along with me, just make sure you tag me in whatever you create after watching this video because I really want to see it. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more design walkthroughs just like this. I really hope you learned something. If you did, go ahead and give this video a like. I post videos like this every week to help y'all become better designers. So subscribe if you don't want to miss out, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace out.